says it will not allow U.S. interference in Hormuz. The Lebanese president says framework deal does not legitimize Israeli presence in Lebanon. And the UN says the RSF committed war crimes in Sudan. Seven p.m. here in Cairo. You're watching Q News. This is our first bulletin with me, Halal Hamalawi. NATO leaders are expected to call on Iran to fully respect freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz during next week's summit in Ankara. According to a document seen by Reuters and approved by NATO ambassadors, alliance leaders will urge Tehran to uphold freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. The document also states that NATO leaders will reiterate that Iran must never acquire nuclear weapons. The positions are expected to be formally announced during the alliance summit in Ankara next week. The meeting comes as diplomatic efforts continue following the recent memorandum of understanding between Washington and Tehran. Shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz surged last week as confidence in the ceasefire continued to grow. The Financial Times, citing industry data, reported that vessel movements through the Strait of Hormuz more than quadrupled over the past week. The increase comes amid growing confidence in the ceasefire and improving security conditions in the region. Meanwhile, the International Maritime Organization said that around 8,000 sailors remain stranded aboard ships in the Gulf. The agency added that it has helped evacuate nearly 2,900 seafarers and 136 vessels so far. Iran's parliament speaker said that Tehran will not allow the United States to interfere in the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian parliament speaker Mohammad Baqir Qalibaf said that Tehran remains committed to implementing its navigation mechanism in the Strait of Hormuz. Qalibaf stressed that Iran would not permit what he described as U.S. interference in the strategic waterway. He added that Tehran plans to consult with countries bordering the Gulf and surrounding regional waters on maritime arrangements. The speaker also said that Iran and Oman have agreed on a navigation mechanism for the strait based on Article 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding.
مسئولیت تنگه وقتی میخواد کنترل بشه که بود مدیریت کنترل بنده که مدیریت بشه ما این مدیریت مثلا با قوانین مدیریت
Iran's defense ministry said that Tehran signed the agreement with the United States in order to help restore stability across the region. The ministry said that Iran entered the agreement with Washington as part of efforts to bring stability back to the region. At the same time, it stressed that Iran's armed forces remain fully prepared. The ministry warned that any violation of the agreement would be met with what it described as an appropriate response. The statement comes as discussions continue over the implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding and security arrangements across the region. Lebanon's foreign minister said that limiting arms to the authority of the state is not an external demand, but an urgent Lebanese necessity. Lebanese foreign minister Youssef Raji said that the issue of arms control is a national need, not a demand imposed from outside. Raji final, but aims to reinforce the independence of Lebanon's national decision-making. The foreign minister stressed that the independence of Lebanese state decisions remains a red line for Beirut. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun said that the framework agreement does not legitimize the continued Israeli presence in Lebanon. President Aoun said that the framework agreement clearly rejects any attempt to legalize Israel's continued presence on Lebanese territory. Aoun said that the deal provides for the deployment of the Lebanese army across all Lebanese territory and the extension of state authority nationwide. He added that the Lebanese armed forces would assume full responsibility for maintaining security and stability in the south following an Israeli withdrawal. The president also defended Lebanon's sovereign decision to separate the Lebanese track from the U.S.-Iran negotiations, saying that the issue remains controversial for some parties. Aoun stressed that incitement, sectarian strife, and attempts to bring down the government through street pressure remain red lines for the Lebanese state. To help us unpack the legal and diplomatic dimensions of the ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiations and the prospects for turning the current Memorandum of Understanding into a lasting agreement, we're joined from Brussels by Dr. Kamila Zarekta-Romanovska, legal scholar and expert on European policy. Dr. Kamila, now, thank you for joining us here on Q News. How is Europe reading the current U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding, especially after the latest talks in Doha?
Well, the US-UN memorandum should not be read as a peace, for sure. It should be read as a fragile legal and diplomatic framework and managing escalation. And from a European perspective, the key issue is not only whether Washington and Tehran can avoid another military confrontation. The deeper question is whether this memorandum can create predictable rules for nuclear restraint, freedom of navigation, Lebanon, and regional security governance. In other words, this is not yet a settlement. It's a test of whether law, diplomacy, and regional mediation can replace a logic of retaliation. And Europe, how to say it, Europe reads this memorandum with very cautious realism. The relief is that Doha talks are still alive because communication itself reduces the risk of accidental escalation. For European governments, it's not yet designed as a durable peace agreement. The European concern is that memorandum contains too many fragile files at once. Iran nuclear program, sanctions, Hormuz, Lebanon, Israel, Hezbollah, in maritime security. That makes the framework strategically important, legally and politically extremely vulnerable. European security perspective is in stake as well. Doha matters because Qatar is not simply hosting talks. Qatar is acting as trusted strategic intermediary in this kind of crisis. Trusted channels are not protocol. They are security infrastructure, diplomatic infrastructure, same wise as well. Europe also sees Egypt as essential and wider reputation. The Suez Canal, Red Sea security, Eastern Mediterranean, migration management and humanitarian logistics make Egypt a strategic anchor for regional stability. And Europe reads those two countries, especially now, as a key security players. For them,
yes,
it's
I
quite
was going
sober.
to ask you, yes, go on, go on.
Yeah, it just finishing because for them it's quite sober. Doha is a progress, but it's not a peace. Memorandum is useful, but it has to become enforceable, verifiable, and regionally supported. And In my opinion, for most of European stakeholders and diplomatic service, this is when Egypt and Qatar becomes essential.
So, from a legal and diplomatic perspective, what would make this memorandum credible enough to move forward to a final agreement?
Well, you always ask a great question. And indeed, in this one, credibility is a word because credibility requires three things: clarity, verification, and the consequences. The text must be clear. The memoranda often use constructive ambiguity to make agreement possible, but ambiguity cannot become the operating system of peace. The parties must clarify what counts as a violation, who verifies compliance, and what happens after the breach. The second thing, which is very important as well, is verification. It needs to be credible. On the nuclear file, that means serious monitoring, transparency, and technical safeguards. On Hormuz, it means predictable maritime rules, freedom of navigation, and crisis management channels. On Lebanon, it means mechanism that does not leave sovereignty, Israel's security and Hezbollah role in permanent contradiction. And yes, the third, consequences. This must be graduated. Not every incident should collapse the agreement, but repeated violation cannot be cost-free. From a legal perspective, the memorandum becomes credible when it moves from political language to institutional architecture. From diplomatic perspective, it becomes credible when Qatar, Egypt, Oman, and other responsible regional actors are not peripheral but part of stabilizing framework of the sustainable peace and security region. A memorandum does not survive because it's signed. It survives because it can manage violation without returning to war. And this is something we would like to really see. Yeah.
Yes, I get your point. Well, European governments seem concerned about both Iran's nuclear file and also the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. So, which issue is more urgent for the EU right now?
In strategic terms, the nuclear file is more existential one. In immediate operational terms, the Hormuz is more urgent.
Yes.
Europe cannot accept Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. That would reshape the entire regional security architecture and create proliferation pressure far beyond the Gulf. This is why NATO message is that Iran must never acquire nuclear weapon. This is so important. But Hormuz is immediate pressure point. If navigation becomes unstable, the consequences are immediate. Energy prices, shipping insurance, supply chains, food security, and inflation. Maritime insecurity becomes human security very quickly and a trigger point for regional instability worldwide. So Europe has a double concern, in opinion. The nuclear file is the long-term strategic red line. Hormuz is short-term systemic risk. This is why Europeans and Europe increasingly treats maritime security as a part of integrated security. The Gulf, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, and the Mediterranean are not longer separated theaters. They form one strategic maritime chain. The smart Europe position is therefore not to choose between nuclear file and Hormuz, but to understand their connection. Nuclear restraint without maritime stability is incomplete. Maritime stability and security without nuclear arms restraint is temporary.
So, NATO leaders are also expected to reaffirm that Iran must never acquire the nuclear weapons. How important is that message at this particular stage?
I think it's very important, but it must be very elegantly and diplomatically calibrated. The message is necessary because nuclear proliferation in the Middle East would fundamentally damage international security. If Iran acquired nuclear weapon, the consequences would not be limited to Iran and Israel. It could trigger regional proliferation, weaken non-proliferation regime, and increase the risk of coercive diplomacy under a nuclear shadow. The message should not be purely declaratory either. Saying never is not enough. The real question is how to build credible pathways that combines deterrence, diplomacy, and verification. Europe has experience here. The European instinct is usually to preserve the non-proliferation regime through inspection, commitments, and institutional mechanisms. But military pressure may delay a program. Only a verification can create a lasting confidence. So NATO message should be firm, but not theatrical one, in my opinion. The purpose is not humiliation. The purpose is predictability. The strongest formula is Iran must not acquire nuclear weapons. The region must avoid war, and any final agreement must be based on verification rather than trust alone.
So, if either side accuses the other of violating the Memorandum of Understanding, what legal or diplomatic mechanisms could prevent a return to escalation?
Well, I do firmly believe in diplomacy, and I think it always can do a magic. But the most important mechanism here is a joint incident management process, in my opinion. In fragile agreements, violations are almost inevitable. The danger is not the first violation. The danger is the absence of mechanisms to classify, investigate, and contain it. There should be several layers. First, direct and indirect hotlines through trusted intermediaries such as Qatar, Oman, and Egypt. Second, technical verification mechanisms for maritime incidents, nuclear-related claims, military movements, etc. Third, a graduate response system distinguishing between accidental incidents, proxy action, and deliberate state violation, as well as hybrid threats that might happen as well. This is especially important in the Gulf, when the single maritime incident can produce political escalation within hours. It is also essential in Lebanon, where actions by Hezbollah or Israeli strikes could be interpreted as a breaches of the wider memorandum. The agreement needs diplomatic shock absorbers. Without them, every incident becomes a test of prestige.
Yes.
The key principle is simple. Violation must have consequences, but not every violation should automatically return to region to the war. We need to balance it.
Yes. So, what should we watch for in the coming days to know whether the talks are moving forward, a durable agreement, or another crisis?
I think that the most important thing now is to actually look for 5 different indicators. Whether Doha produces a technical clarity, not just positive language. The important question is whether the parties agree on mechanism. And when I'm saying about Doha, I'm talking about the peace process, of course. Second is a maritime behavior in the Hormuz. If shipping stabilizes and the insurance risk declines, that suggests the memorandum is gaining operational credibility.
Yes.
Other thing is rhetoric from Tehran and Washington. If both sides begin speaking to domestic audience in maximalist terms, diplomacy becomes more fragile. And Lebanon, any Israeli strike, Hezbollah response, or dispute over security zones could become a trigger that tests the entire framework. And it's important as well to see what will be the NATO meeting in Ankara. What will be the final message? If NATO combines a firm nuclear red line with support of freedom of navigation and diplomatic de-escalation, that strengthens the framework. If the message becomes too confrontational,
Confrontational.
Indeed, it may narrow diplomatic space.
Yes.
And I always believe that diplomatic space and diplomatic cooperation is always vital. It's always can step in and buy us some extra time to figure out most durable and more durable solution. And the coming days will show to us whether this memorandum becoming a pathway to manage stability or maybe a pause before another crisis. The future of memorandum will not be decided by signatures alone, I think. It will be decided by implementation of nuclear verification, those freedom of navigation, Lebanon, the crisis channels, and regional ownership. And I think Qatar mediations, Egypt's strategic stability, Oman diplomatic bridge, this is building a quite new perspective, and Europe's legal institutional capacity, this all matters. And the real question is not whether the parties can avoid escalation for a few days. The real question will be if they can build mechanisms strong enough to prevent next crisis from becoming the next war. We all would love to see the whole Middle East and the Gulf and Europe living peacefully and securely.
Definitely. Dr. Kamila Zarikta-Romanovska, legal scholar and EU policy expert, joining us from Brussels. Thank you so much for your valuable insights and being with us here on Q News. Moving on with our news bulletin, the Israeli military said that it carried out 4 strikes in southern Lebanon over the past week, targeting Hezbollah members. The Israeli military said that its forces conducted 4 strikes in southern Lebanon last week against Hezbollah elements. It also said that 10 Hezbollah-linked infrastructure sites were attacked on Tuesday in Bint Jbeil and Beit Hanun, Kunin, and Barakit. The Israeli military claimed that the strikes came in response to attacks targeting Israeli forces in what it called the security zone in southern Lebanon. The latest attacks come amid continued tensions over the ceasefire and security arrangements along the border. Moving on, the United Nations said that the Rapid Support Forces have committed war crimes in Sudan and is calling for greater pressure to protect the civilians. The United Nations accused the Rapid Support Forces of committing war crimes during the conflict in Sudan. The organization called for increased international pressure on the RSF to end attacks on civilians. It also warned of the risk of further atrocities in the city of Al Ubaid in North Kordofan, saying that conditions there are rapidly deteriorating. The UN said that civilians in North Kordofan have endured conditions resembling a siege for the past 18 months. It further stressed that the international community must not allow a repeat of the atrocities witnessed in Zamzam and El Fasher. The road to World Cup glory is entering its most decisive stage as the knockout rounds begin to separate the contenders from the pretenders. Now, with the place in the quarterfinals at stake, the pressure is rising and every match carries the weight of history. Let's take a look at the latest developments from the FIFA World Cup 2026.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
If you look at that,
Egypt is set to face Australia in the World Cup round of 32, aiming to extend a historic campaign after reaching the knockout stage for the very first time. Egypt finished second in their group, securing a landmark first win and 2 draws. Despite key absences, Egypt remained confident with Mohamed Salah fit to lead the attack. Officials stressed determination to advance further as Australia pose a physical challenge in a high-stakes knockout clash. Switzerland booked their place in the World Cup round of 16 with a 2-0 victory over Algeria in the round of 32. Switzerland national football team secured their spot in the last 16 after defeating Algeria national football team by 2-0. Bril Imbolo opened the scoring early in the 10th minute to give Switzerland the advantage. Dan Nodoye doubled the lead shortly after the restart, capitalizing on a defensive mistake. Despite several attempts by Algeria to get back into the match, Switzerland held firm to preserve the clean sheet and seal qualification. The Swiss side will now face the winner of the clash between Colombia and Ghana in the round of 16, while Algeria's World Cup campaign comes to an end. That's the end of our news bulletin for today. But before we go, here's a quick recap of the top stories making headlines this hour. Iran says it will not allow U.S. interference in Hormuz. Lebanese president says framework deal does not legitimize Israeli presence in Lebanon. And the UN says the RSF committed war crimes in Sudan. This concludes this hour's Q News Bulletin. As the day's developments continue to unfold, our coverage continues as well. I'm Helen Al-Hamalawi. Stay with us here on Q News.